Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Berechot, chapter 6, Halacha 7, very short and very clear mishnah, very short and very clear gemara. And the mishnah is going to have a really novel application of this law when it deals with the blessing on a primary food, and then that's going to exempt the subordinate one. Now, we're going to get back into this whole course of appetizers, and we know that generally what was done, says the Rashi, is that a salted fish dish would be brought out as one of these appetizers in the before the meal would be done, and there would be a separate waiting room. And they would eat in this sort of, preparation dining area, this like foyer, or they'd have their hors d'oeuvres over there, and then they would go into a main eating area and have a proper meal over there. But again, you have this change of makom from this place to that place, and this is what's going to be happening because this fish dish is really going to be a primary food. And then you're going to have a subordinate one that's going to be there. So that's going to be the idea. It's really getting into this idea of primary food and subordinate one. And if the law of the blessing is going to on the primary one going to dispatch the obligation on the subordinate one. And we're going to use fish to do that. So the Mishnah says if they brought him salted fish initially and bread was brought with it. Now in the setup of this Mishnah, you can see that the main thing here is going to be this salted fish. That's that's what he's really paying attention to. That's the main part of it. And why are they bringing the bread? They're bringing it as an accompaniment. It's a side thing so that it's not as salty. That's the idea. It's eating the main thing that you're eating in this appetizer is the salted fish. And the cracker is just there to balance out the saltiness of it. And you see that all the time today in cuisine from all over the world, whether it's going to be in Russia or in Scandinavia or in France, and they'll have something where they'll have some salted fish and they'll put it with blintzes or blinis, or they'll put it with little crackers, or they'll put it with a little bit of toast that's actually bread that's toasted. Very common all over the world. In Japan, in fact, they have a older type of sushi that's salted and vinegared, and they'll put it, match it with rice. It's a little bit different than the nigiri sushi that you're used to, but this is done all over the world, and it was done here in Israel as well, no difference. Now, the Mishnah is pointing out that the salted fish is brought first, and the bread is an accompaniment. The bread is not the main part. Right? So the order here in the Mishnah is pointing that out to prove this point. And the Mishnah continues and says, he recites a blessing on the salted food, and this discharges his blessing on the bread as well. And the Mishnah finishes up that and says, for the bread is subordinate to the salted fish. And again, you have this this law. It's a very basic law about primary and subordinate. And we know this from the Mishnah before in chapter 6, Halacha 5 and 6. It comes up in 5, and it emerges that it was taught that the blessing on the bread will exempt peripheral dishes over there in chapter 6, Halacha 5. And that's going to be when you're having dishes that's served during the meal. And the reason why is the bread is going to be the primary thing, and these little salads are going to be subordinate to the bread. But this Mishnah is saying something a little bit different, that the bread can become subordinate to something else. So you have a basic rule in Judaism that you have a primary food and a subordinate food, and you should think about foods that way. You can think about it in a lot of the courses that you eat in modern cuisine as well, that a lot of times there'll be a main thing that you're eating. A lot of times it'll be the protein, and then there'll be things to support that protein, and that, sometimes you'll see people, eating some of the protein together with some of those supporting things to improve the flavor of the accompaniments. A famous thing that you could think about, is going to be like meatballs and spaghetti, where, you could have it where, the main thing is going to be the meatballs, and, you have a little bit of spaghetti to eat together with it. Well, the main thing is going to be the meat in that case. Well, in the case here, the subordinate thing is going to be the bread. And that's what's really interesting about it. In other words, you can have a case, the Mishnah is pointing out that you can have a case where the bread is subordinate. Now, that's really important because the bread is not a catch-all that, if you have a little bit of bread, that no matter what else you're eating, the bread is going to be the primary thing. No, this is a case where your main thing is going to be that fish, and you really want that fish, but you're going to be eating the bread to balance out the saltiness of the primary thing, which is the fish. And that's the novel part of this rule. Now, the Mishnah is going to lay out this very important rule that we have in prayer in Judaism. And this is the rule, says the Mishnah: in any case where you have a food that is primary and a subordinate food is eaten with it, one recites the blessing on the primary food, and he discharges his obligation for the subordinate food as well. So the idea, I like what the Rabbi Akiva Eger's saying about this. He's saying that usually when a Mishnah says a general rule after a specific example, it's to teach an aspect of the law that might otherwise not be apparent. Now, why would that be? Well, we were just covering about how normally bread is going to make everything else, like all of these salads, to be the salads being subordinate and the bread being primary. Hey, you have bread. Well, Rebbe and the tradition comes along and says, no, we have to put this Mishnah in because it's not really apparent that, hey, if you're eating in this case like the fish with this example here, it's showcasing this primary rule and subordinate rule. Now, if you didn't have this, you would come to think that anytime you ate bread, you would be having to say the whole thing, and the blessing on the bread would be dispatching what would be the main part of the meal. You would end up with this very strange situation where the main thing you're trying to eat is this salted fish in this appetizer course, and you have some of the bread. And if you didn't know this rule, then you would think that anytime you're eating bread, because of the specialness of bread, that it's somehow going to become primary, and that you would say the bracha on this small cracker piece of bread toast to dispatch the obligation on the salted fish. And in fact, you need this because it's showing that's not the case. In other words, without this, and the Rabbi Akiva Eger is correct on this, that you would not necessarily know this rule. It wouldn't be apparent. And that's why he's pointing out that when the Mishnah is saying a general rule after a specific example, it's to teach something that's not obvious. And he continues about this, that in this case, someone would have thought that, like in the preceding case, the sheikol blessing on the salted fish would be enough because, the bread, for the bread, only because sheikol after the fact is going to be a valid blessing for the bread. In other words, you would say the sheikol on the main part of the fish, and people would misunderstand it, and they would say, oh, you said sheikol because that's one thing that you can do which will cover bread, right? It's a catch-all. In case you're not sure, the sheikol is always going to be a catch-all for brachas, and this is showing something a little bit different. The reasoning is nuanced, and it's showing that, and this Mishnah is showing that the subordinate food is always going to be exempted from the blessing of the primary food. And that's really the point. And that's why this blessing is going to be recited. In other words, this she'akol blessing is recited not because you're trying to dispatch the obligation on the bread in a roundabout way. No, you're saying the she'akol blessing because your primary thing is the fish, and the minor thing, the subordinate thing, is the bread. And your she'akol blessing dispatches the obligation of the bread. And it should not be thought that you say a she'akol blessing as a roundabout way to cover the blessing on the bread, because doraita that would cover it in a worst case scenario. But that's not what you do. You do the whole blessing on the bread thing because that's really the right way to do it. But technically speaking, would that cover it? Yes, right? So you could get confused in this and think that you're really saying the she'akol blessing on the bread and covering the fish. Or you could be saying the she'akol blessing on the fish, thinking that you're dispatching the obligation on the bread. And that's not what's happening. You are saying the she'akol blessing on the fish, and that she'akol is not being used as a standalone for the bread. What's happening is the bread is going to be eaten there, and the primary blessing on the fish is she'akol, and that covers the subordinate food, which is the bread. So there's a lot of nuance there, and it's very important that the Mishnah puts this in so that you can understand what is going to be the primary food, the subordinate food, and what happens when the food is going to be eaten together. There's also going to be, a question on this, and really, the Or Chaim is going to cover it in 2:12, and it's going to talk about when a subordinate food is eaten together with a primary food or after it, and regarding a case where a subordinate food is going to be eaten before the primary food. So that's going to get a lot into attention, but basically this is going to be the idea and the rule, and that's why I want to point out this nuance on it. And the Gemara is going to get into an explanation of this ruling. And Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachman says in the name of Rabbi Yonatan, the Mishnah, which treats the bread as subordinate to the salted fish, describes the law that applied in earlier times. And the Gemara says that when people had not yet accustomed themselves to eat in the manner of royal feasts, so they often ate salted fish as a pre-meal appetizer. And the Haredim explains about this, that Rabbi Yonatan understands the phrase that if they brought salted fish initially to mean that the fish was served before the meal as an appetizer, and it was common, says the Haredim, in earlier times for a meal to begin with a salty appetizer, and later people started to take on the style of eating royal feasts, which would have sweet appetizers, and it was in fashion to have sweet appetizers in the beginning and the salty food during the meal. But originally, in the old days and the ways of your forefathers, it was done as a tradition here that the salty food would be an appetizer, and with the influence of Goyim, it later turned around that the appetizer became the sweet part, and then salty food would be moved during the meal. And the Mishnah is going to talk about the situation in which salty food is an appetizer, says the Haredim. Now, the Gemara is going to continue, and it's going to say that, and its rule pertains specifically in a case where people treat the salted fish as a primary food, where it is actually eaten as an appetizer, and regarding a situation where they do not treat salted food as the primary food, like when salted fish will be eaten during the bread meal, and the case of eating it as part of the bread meal, that's the idea, the Mishnah and this ruling does not apply to this situation. So this is a clarification by Rabbi Yonatan that this Mishnah is only applying in the case where you have this pre-appetizer meal with salted fish. And by the way, as we were learning about in chapter 6, Halacha 6, that there was going to be a different makom where this meal would be served, and then they would go and they would eat in a formal dining room. So you have a change of place issue happening there. So you really have as an intention that you're in a separate room for where you're going to be dining. And here you are, and you're served this primary thing. That's going to be this kind of expensive salted fish. And then maybe you'll have a much cheaper and smaller toast to go with it. And the idea is that this is only covering that sort of situation. This is not covering the case, says Rabbi Yonatan, where you're going into the formal dining room. You've had a small series of appetizers that are sweet, and now you're going to have the salty foods in the main course, like what became vogue later on with trying to emulate the style of royal feasts that became popular from non-Jewish influence that was here. And what would happen is now you have a case where it could look like this mishnah is applying to something special about fish in general, and it's saying, no, now you've moved into this new place. You're eating the fish as a pre-part of this bread meal. You're washing for bread, and now you're having the salted fish, and the bracha that you would be saying would not be on the salted fish. It would be on the bread, and it would cover the fish. That's going to be the idea. And even if they brought this as an appetizer in this separate dining room after this third appetizer course is set in this pre-function room before you're going into the main dining room, and they're serving it in a case where you know this bread meal is about to come, and they're serving this as a thing just to do just before you wash, well, that's going to be a case where it's going to be where it's not really done as an appetizer. It's really being done as the main part of the meal. So the idea is that when salted fish is going to be served during the meal itself with bread, the fish is not a primary food, and it's viewed as a side to the bread. And the main part of the meal, the part that's going to fill you up, the part that has sustenance, is going to be the bread. Now, there's another thing in the halacha that we were covering, that the thing that's going to be giving you sustenance is going to have priority over the things that don't give you sustenance. So, for instance, if you have some vegetables in front of you and you have cabbage there, it would be proper to be saying the bracha on the cabbage before the other vegetables. We covered this in chapter 6 already, because the cabbage is considered something that gives you sustenance, like a grain product. So the idea here is that it's the bread that's giving you sustenance in this meal, not the salted or satisfaction or something that's going to give you satiation. It's not going to be the salted fish. The salted fish is going to be accompaniment. And the reason this is going to be like this is that, even if you have the fish, that's going to be like a main course, and you're going to have bread at, this kind of meal, it's the bread that's giving you satisfaction and satiating you, right? So that even if they brought out a giant grilled fish, and it's not salted, it's just a giant grilled grouper, and they have that on the coast in Israel. You can find that all along the coast. They'll catch very big grouper, and they grill it, and it's delicious, and it's kosher, and it's good for you. And maybe they serve you a pita to go with it. Well, it looks like the main thing is going to be that grilled fish. But again, the halacha is going to be going on what's going to create satiation in the meal. So that's why you're going to be doing it on the bread, and that you're going to have to say all of this stuff, because the bread becomes primary. And even though you have a very, very big grilled grouper in front of you, the fish still is going to be subordinate, because that's going to be, it's the bread that's going to give you satiation. It's not the grilled fish. And in a time when you had fish that was eaten as a snack or an appetizer, the bread would be considered subordinate only if it's there to counteract the fishiness or the saltiness of it. In other words, if you're doing it where you're being like a chef or like a gourmet guy, and you're saying, I want to counterbalance the taste of the salt on the fish, and I don't want too much salt taste in my mouth, and so I want something to balance it out. Well, if you're coming along and doing that, and by the way, the Mishnah Beur in 2:12:3 is gonna echo this idea. Why is that? Because you're not eating it for the bread itself. You're eating it for the fish. But the fish is still too sharp or salty or fishy from being alone. And the bread is there to accompany it. And if the bread is going to be there as a subordinate to accompany it, then that's going to be the case. That's the idea here. Now, the Gemara is going to move on. It's going to talk about another case where you have bread that's going to be subordinate to another food. So we're going to have another case about this, giving you. So the idea, by the way, is that this Mishnah is really pointing out a hekish, right? So what is a hekish? A hekish is where they have a single example in a Gemara or in the Torah or the Tanakh, and it's applied to other cases as well. The most famous one is where you're having in Baba Metzia, chapter 2, and you can look over there in Halacha 3, and you can see all the laws for Shulchas Aveda. And why does that matter? Well, the Torah says if somebody loses a donkey. Well, that's really a hekish for any other thing that somebody loses. A Jew loses a stroller. A Jew loses a bag. A Jew loses his hat. Well, the laws of Shulchas Aveda in the Torah are just saying a donkey. So if they're losing that stroller, you still have the laws of Shulchas Aveda. I had a case where my Rav card, which is my bus card, dropped out of my pocket at the kosher butcher here in Harnof. And I went back and went to go buy some food. And he saw my face from the card. And he gave me back the card and said, Shulchas Aveda. And he did the same thing. Even though the Torah says a donkey, he returned my Rav card, my bus card, back to me and got the same credit, because the point there is just that it's not necessarily a donkey per se. It's a generality from something specific, so that we're knowing that it could apply to anything else. And just like this, it's talking about other foods as well. It's not only talking about the salted fish. The salted fish is the easiest one to understand because you've had salted fish. There's a saltiness to it. The main part is the salty fish, but you want to balance it out in your mouth. And that's why you have a little bit of a toast to do it. It blends it together, it evens it out, and it's not too much. So you also know that in sushi, you might have a piece of salmon nigiri sushi, and you have some nice rice that's served underneath it, and you might dip it in a little bit of salty soy sauce, and the rice helps to balance out the saltiness of the rice and the soy sauce, and it evens it out, and it's delicious. And that's the idea. Now, there's going to be other cases as well. The Gemara is going to get into other cases where bread is going to be subordinate to another food. And the Gemara says, Rabbi Yirmiyah says in the name of Rav, one who eats bread with poror. Now, what is poror? Poror is going to be another type of salted fish that's going to be eaten with bread as an appetizer. And the Pnei Moshe is going to identify this as a dish that has breadcrumbs that would be blended together with gravy. And in that way, the breadcrumbs, they lose the appearance of bread, says the Pnei Moshe. And that this dish is going to be very salty and oily. So the bread is going to be there to even out the saltiness or oiliness. That's going to be the idea from the Pnei Moshe about this. So I like the explanation from the Pnei Moshe on this better than the Haredim. Haredim is saying that it's another type of salted fish. But I can imagine that perhaps you have a very, very nice gravy and you're pouring it onto a toast with some vegetables or something like that. And if you have these breadcrumbs that lose the appearance of bread, well, then the blessing would be Beurim b'nei mesanot. So, that would be something where, that wouldn't be the case. It would be a case where this toasted bread would maintain the appearance so that you could identify it as bread, but the main part becomes this gravy, and that you're really, the idea is you're eating this gravy, and the bread is just to hold it and even out the saltiness. This is some kind of dish. I can't think of a modern example of what this would be, but nonetheless, the Gemara is talking about it. And Rabbi Yirmiyah is saying that, one recites the blessing on the pourer and thereby discharges the bread of its blessing obligation. So this is a kind of a dish. You could probably imagine if you had a very, very salty cheese, and the salty, you had a very hard salty cheese, right? And you want to have a cracker, not a cracker, like a little piece of toast to even out the saltiness of this very salty cheese. And I make cheese at home sometimes, and you have to put in vinegar and salt to do it. And sometimes it can be, salty, because as the cheese dehydrates, as you dry it out, it will harden, and it has a saltiness to it. Well, maybe you don't want all the saltiness of just eating that cheese raw. Well, that would be another case. So it would be like this pourer example, but in this case of this pourer, says the Pnei Moshe, it's going to be some sort of salty dish where the breadcrumbs are mixed with this gravy, and perhaps it's served on top of this toast, something like that. And maybe they're putting it in with some chopped vegetables to give it some freshness. The Gemara is going to talk about this ruling, and they're going to say that this pertains only in a situation where people make the pourer primary, where it's eaten as an appetizer. So what would that be? They're saying that this oily, gravy heavy breadcrumb mixture that might even be mixed together and put on top of a bread. Perhaps they chop in some scallions and things like that, and they're doing a gravy from like a chicken stock or something, and they're using some breadcrumbs to bind it, and then they're serving it on a toast. That's something that I could see being palatable. The idea is that this pourer is primary, and the bread is just going to be there to even out the saltiness. And the Gemara continues, says, but regarding a situation where they do not make the pourer primary, where it's eaten during the bread meal proper, the ruling does not apply to this situation. So this would be a case where the bread is going to be the primary food, and you're going to have the homotzi, and that's going to cover this pourer in the case of it being like a side dish in a main bread meal. So in the case of an appetizer, something like this you would have, even though it's bread, you would have it where the main thing, in this case the pourer, would be dispatching the obligation on the bread. Now, let's say you had the pourer where it's going to be this gravy, and it's going to be mixed together with these breadcrumbs, and it's going to be served on a toast, and perhaps in this pourer they chop in some scallions and cilantro, which they had here in the land, and they're going to give it some freshness, and they're going to try to make it really nice. It has a nice reduced chicken stock that they're putting with the breadcrumbs, and then they're putting it with some, salad leaves that go, chopped up onto it, and a little bit of toast. Well, the pourer is going to be the main thing, and so you're going to say the blessing will be mesanot, because it's mixed together with these breadcrumbs that have lost the appearance of bread. And in this kind of case, you wouldn't be saying the bracha on the bread with the pourer on it, because the main thing you're eating is this sort of spread, this salty, gravy, oily chicken spread with some, herbs chopped into it to give it some freshness and lift it up. And in that sort of case, you would be saying the main blessing, which would be Beurim b'nei mesanot. You wouldn't be saying something with the blessing on the bread with homotzi, because the main thing is that the pourer. That's going to be the idea here. Now, the Gemara is going to give another kind of example, and the Pnei Moshe is going to be talking about a dish that is going to be sweet, and it's going to be made out of almonds and flowers and spices, and it's going to be sweet, and it's going to be eaten together with the bread. Why would that be? Because this is very, very sweet, and it's going to be eaten to even out the sweetness of the food. So before we were talking about very, very salty, or in the case of the poorer, perhaps it's oily, right? So you're using the bread to even out the oiliness of it. And in this case, we're going to go the other way, and we're going to talk about something that's very, very sweet. And Rabbi Simon says, in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, one who eats shekizme with bread recites the blessing on the shekizme, and then he discharges the obligation of the bread with the blessing of the shekizme. Now, the shekizme is going to be the dish that's going to be made with shekadim, which are almonds and flowers and spices, and perhaps they're going to use some sort of honey to bind it all together and caramelize it, and perhaps it's too sweet to eat on its own. And so the point is that you're putting it with a small piece of toast, and your main thing is going to be this shekizme, and that's going to be where it's going to be we know it's made from almonds because it's something from the word of shekadim, which are going to be almonds, and the idea is that this is going to be the primary, and the blessing on the primary, which is going to be this very sweet food, is going to cover this other one with the bread. Now the Gemara is going to qualify this, and it's going to say that this pertains only in a case where the people make the shekizme primary and where it's going to be eaten as an appetizer, but regarding a situation where they do not make the shekizme primary, where it's eaten during a bread meal proper, the ruling does not apply to this situation. So what the Gemara is trying to do is the Gemara is trying to go through this and explain the nuance of law on when this case would be happening, and trying to highlight the cases about primary food and subordinate food, and what can be in a case of a party where you're having appetizers. And what's more commonly known for us is going to be a normal sort of bread meal, but you do have appetizers and you do have hors d'oeuvres. And so this is going to be the case of the brachas for that. It's always important to study the brachas because it's something that connects you with Hashem, and it connects you to the divine plan, and it connects you with the fixing of the world. So brachas are very important to work on. Have a great day.